Let's Be Wizards is a game that I've been working on for more than a year now, and it all started with this little stack of paper. What I did is I cut them up into card-sized, well, I guess cards, and I set a bunch of rules and doodled a bunch of stuff and wrote down a bunch of stuff on these blank cards to come up with the cards themselves and design them. I'm going to go through the design process. I'm going to go through a bunch of different things that happened during the process of making this game all the way up into its final form, I guess you could say. So let's start off with one of the basic things. In the game, even in the original game, there was things that you could add to the world. In the original game, those things were fire, water, light, darkness, and for some reason, storm. I'm not sure why storm was there, but if I remember correctly, storm was supposed to be the most powerful thing that you could add to the world. In the original game, you would shuffle these up, essentially, and then flip two random ones face up, and these would be the things that start in the world. You would also take your deck of cards, shuffle them up, and then divide them into about 4 different decks. You would take 4 cards from the top, another 4 from the top, and then another 4 from the top, and you would do that until you had 4 decks face up in front of you, or face down in front of you, I guess, technically. And then, every time your turn starts, you would take 2 6-sided dice, roll them, and then choose one of your 4 decks that you have placed face down, and add those to your hand, and those would be the cards that you could use for this turn. The dice would be your mana. So I rolled a 5 and a 6, so my mana for this turn would be 11, which would obviously be very powerful. For some reason, there was other things you could add to the world as well, including stones, which made its way to the final game as well. For whatever reason, on these cards, I don't have stone. It may be because I actually just ended up using the stone from a later version of it and just took it out of this deck or something. But originally, it was supposed to have stones as well. For some reason, I doodled over these, though. As you can see, some of these cards cost mana, some of them have HP and stuff like that. I believe these first 3 right here were meant to be wizards, because you would also start off with a wizard, basically, and they would have different effects, like, oh, your page size is 5, so you have 5 cards in your book or whatever, each. But they all have different costs. This costs 1 mana to play, this costs 2 mana to play, this costs 4, and so on and so on. And you saw earlier that I rolled 11, so I'd be able to play basically everything in my hand. When you played them, you would put it face up, reveal it to everyone, and then slap it back into your hand and pick it up and all that other jazz. That's something that carried over to the final form of the game. Some of these also required certain things, so this would cost water, so you would have to remove water from the world to play it, so water would also obviously have to be in the thing. But this basically would allow you to take the 4 cards in your hand, put them face down, and then pick up one of your other stacks that you had earlier. That's what it means when it's referencing like spell books and stuff like that. So these also had some that carried over to the final game, such as this one right here, which adds a volcano to the world, and then after 3 turns you just remove everything from the world. This actually carried over to the final version of the game, which is kind of interesting. Some of the other ones also carried over, stuff like that, like shuffle any player's spellbook together and then divide them as evenly as possible into 2 new spellbooks. That was another thing that carried over to the final form of the game. And also this one here as well, where if fire is in the world, you can cast anything that's been burnt, which are cards that got discarded or removed from the game or whatever. This one also had a lot of other weird things where you could summon creatures and stuff, where you could summon a dragon with 3 power, so the creatures themselves had power, and it also had other abilities and stuff like that that you could give them. And the creatures, if they were out when you ended your turn, it would do 1 damage to an opponent or something like that. And it was a whole bunch of different stuff, so you could summon crabs and lizards and dragons and all kinds of other random things like that. This is weird too. I've noticed that in some of these, because it's been a really long time since I drew these up, but some of them cost death, which wasn't one of the original like 5 things you could add to the world, and there's other references to things that you can add to the world that weren't in this stack for some reason. So I think what ended up happening was I just decided I wasn't going to draw up fire, death, and all these other random things that you could add to the world, since you could always just put like a token or something on the field to kind of represent that. But these are all the original doodles for this stuff. Things that require stone, things that sacrifice creatures, and all kinds of other stuff. There is a ton of things here. There's probably about 50 or 60 cards here. But when all of that was said and done, I put it away for a while I thought about the project for a little bit, and then eventually I was able to get my hands on these blank cards. I got these for Christmas one year, and I decided this is the perfect time to go back to the original game and kind of tweak it a little bit more and get more of a finalized version. The first thing I decided was I'm not going to use dice, and I'm going to get rid of mana entirely. I'm also going to get rid of life points, HP, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to get rid of all of that stuff. I don't want it in here. I want dice, though. I want to keep dice, but I don't want to use standard dice. So what I decided was that I was going to make my own custom dice, because the set that I got these blank cards in also came with blank dice that I could doodle on. And I decided that you would start your turn by rolling the dice instead, and that would then dictate what spells you could play from your hand. I also decided to keep that you would always start with 4 cards in your hand and hold on to 4 at any given time, but this new version didn't have you have 4 spellbooks. You only had 1 singular spellbook, because what I had discovered from playtesting this version so many times over was that you're basically screwed like 100% of the time, and it gets really bad. A lot of bad things happen when you split it into 4 different decks, each with 4 cards. A lot of bad stuff happens, and so I decided that you're going to get a spell book of about 15 pages or cards or whatever, and you were going to start with 4 of those from the top into your hand, and it was going to do all kinds of other stuff. So that's what I ended up going with, and I decided that each card would have to have some kind of spell symbol on it that you would have to match to the thing. So that matches this. Ooh, that means I can play this one, but if I rolled like this, I wasn't able to play it. So, but back to the things in the world. In the new version, I decided to keep stone, because in the old version, stone was very powerful and useful, and there was a lot of cool things you could do with it. And I decided I really liked that mechanic, so I wanted to keep not only stone, but also keep the other things in the world and have cards that require these things to be in the world. So we had stone and fear and water and light and fire and darkness, which has fallen in the floor somewhere and I cannot find it. But darkness, I guess it's hidden in the dark, but I've lost darkness. It was in this stack somewhere, but darkness was also one of the things that you could add to the world. So 6 things that can be added to the world. But just like the original game, you would start by shuffling up the things that can be added to the world, and you would flip them face up based on how many players there are. So if you have 2 players, you would reveal 2. If you had 3, you would reveal 3. And if you had 4, you would reveal 4, just like so. Hey, there's darkness right there. That's kind of crazy. It's sneaking up on us. If there's 4 players, you would have 4 of these added to the world, and then you would start the game, and throughout the game, more things could be added to the world, and some things could be removed from the world, allowing you to re-add them later. So these is a deck of 60 cards that I actually decided to actually design and doodle and stuff. In the original version, where it was just pieces of paper, they didn't actually have any kinds of designs or anything like that. It was literally just text, and that was so that I could do it in the simplest form possible. I didn't want to waste a bunch of time drawing cards when I didn't even know if the game was going to work or not, and I knew for a fact I was most likely going to have to redraw all these anyway. But when it came down to these like more like cards, like it's more proper cards, blank cards, I decided to actually draw them, because I was pretty confident with this new version of it, and also I knew when I came to draw them digitally, I could just take a picture of this and then draw over it, kind of trace my own art in that respect. And also, if I wanted to like play test this with other people, which I did eventually do, they wouldn't look at a bunch of text and that's it. They would have something nicer to kind of look at. But a lot of cards in this version ended up being redesigned a million times. Shroud Loud is an example of that. It used to be extremely overpowered in the sense that basically you couldn't do anything to me without hurting yourself. I changed it to where you can only do that about once a turn. Spike Rain is the biggest offender of this, where I've changed it probably a dozen times now. It used to be insanely powerful, where you could just kill everything on the board basically and do a bunch of damage to your opponents by getting rid of their spellbook and stuff like that. It did a lot of stuff, and there wasn't much consequence for it. The first thing I decided to change about it was that after you played it, it gets discarded, it gets burnt, and it goes away forever. Another version of it was like, okay, well, it can only burn 2 things now instead, or it doesn't remove all creatures. I played around with a bunch of different versions of this, but ultimately decided that it does indeed remove all creatures, and then everyone gets hurt that lost a creature, but otherwise, if you didn't have a creature, you're kind of fine. And then again, it also gets burnt, so you can never use it again, or potentially never use it again. And there are creatures, I decided to keep those as well, but they work very differently. You play the creature from your hand instead of having to like play a spell to add a dragon to the world. Instead, it's just literally physically a card you can just put down. And they also do different effects and stuff like that. But there is no damage, there is no health that players have, so these things don't actually do damage to your opponents at the end of your turn. Instead, what they do is they have these little special abilities. For example, with Slug of Allen, if a player casts a death spell, burn that page afterwards. Which this version of this card has pretty much stayed the same since this iteration of it. In the original 60, there were a duplicate of Nexus. Nexus was in here twice. I did this because in this version of the game, there wasn't many things to add to the world, or, well, many cards to add to the world. You had Nexus, and that was about it. That was about the only card that could really add anything to the world, and so I decided that I may as well just make a duplicate of it and then have that in there. That way, whenever you're playing, you're almost guaranteed to be able to add something to the world, because there's a lot of cards that require things to be the world, such as Lunestone Levitate. Stone has to be in the world for you to be able to use this, otherwise you just can't even use it and it's completely useless. Another card too, Cover of Darkness, is something that I kind of wanted to mention briefly, because it also went through a couple of different iterations, and I ended up changing its text to something called Protected, which basically makes it so I can save a bunch of space on cards, and so that was super helpful for that. And obviously there's a bunch of cards in here that do a bunch of different things. Some of the art has changed on some of them, and some of them have remained the same. Well, I say some of them, but most of them have remained the same, but some digital versions, such as like Firewind, I think personally looks so much better in a digital form instead of like on this piece of paper here, because it has color and everything. I personally love how Finger Blast turned out. This is the original version, and of course the finalized version is on screen with you too. Vortex was another really fun one to make, because I was able to just take a bunch of other cards and then put them in this card. But as time went on, I finally was going through digital stuff. I decided that now would be a good time to maybe even redesign some of the spell symbols and stuff like that, or maybe make them a little bit more cohesive. So as you can see here in Ashlink Necromancy, that is supposed to be an element symbol, which is supposed to be this symbol, which is supposed to be kind of like a piece of fire. But then when I went to go do it digitally, I realized, hang on a minute, element isn't just fire, it's also water and everything else. So I decided to make this cool shape here, and I decided to keep it red and orange for simplicity's sake, because I wanted each symbol to have its own unique color, and I couldn't do like basically every color for this one. Although I guess I technically could still go back and change it to be rainbow colored or something, but still. The death symbol stayed pretty much the same. It's literally just a skull with black effects behind it and stuff. The clover symbol, which is this thing right here, it pretty much stayed the same as well. I just made it green. And the paw print, which is this was originally meant to be a paw print, this symbol, but because of the dice, it didn't really end up looking that great. It didn't really end up looking like a paw print because it was really hard to draw on this dice. So when I finally was able to come into digitally, I was able to make it a proper paw print, but that is technically what all of these little circle things are supposed to be. And Life had the biggest change, and it was actually the most recent change that I've made in the game, where it was this symbol, and then it turned into this symbol, and now finally it is a heart. Part of that was based on feedback from a play test, where the symbol was hard to describe, and its color was kind of hard to see because it was blue, but it had these black outlines around it, and since the little swirl is so thin, it was kind of hard to see, so it was kind of hard to describe and everything. So we ended up changing that to be a heart basically, and so I think that ultimately is a much better option. Some of the creatures like Daitor have remained the same as well. And that is, I think, pretty much all the cards I want to go through for this, instead of just showing you every single one of the cards. I guess I could potentially explain the rules a little bit better to you guys, but I might save that for another video or something like that. It is extremely simple. I'm pretty close to finishing this up. I think there's not really much else left for me to do besides double checking, triple checking the cards, maybe play test one or two more times. I might do that for a stream at some point. That could be fun. But yeah, let me know in the comments below what you guys think of this game, what you guys think of the process and everything. And if you guys want more stuff like this, where I talk about some of these games that I've been working on for a while, let me know in the comments below, because I have a dozen more that I can share with you guys, and it will definitely be a ton of fun to share them all. So please do consider liking, subscribing, sharing, and doing all of those wonderful things like that, because when you do wonderful things like that, not only do you get access to wonderful content such as this, but you also get to become wonderful yourself, and I think we all want that. So do those wonderful things, and until next time, stay wonderful.